All right, welcome, Drink with James, episode 94. It has been a week on the internet. Last week, Instagram started limiting what you could do on their API. And third-party apps such as Four started to feel the effect of that a little bit. First of all, we'll step back, right? These businesses, they create these APIs so that developers will create products with them so that their products become more foundational to the entire internet. And as you become increasingly dependent on those APIs to drive, hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of other websites, products, and services, it becomes less and less likely that those core services will stop being used. Just think about how many things you log into using your Facebook account that you don't even know your username and password to them, right? So it makes it so that having Facebook makes everything a lot easier. So they restricted greatly, they restricted what you could do on those APIs. And just yesterday, on the 4th, they essentially cut out 90% of the information that Instagram gave you through the API. Now, our platform wasn't affected that much. We probably have 90%, 95% of the functionality that we had last week is still in existence today. But there are a lot of services that don't exist anymore that are scrambling to try and figure out how to continue to operate. I know a lot of you have third-party Instagram analytics tools that you use that no longer work. I know Like It to Know It doesn't work anymore. So there's been, a pretty big shakeup in our world. And, Instagram and Facebook are in an interesting place right now. They've lost $100 billion of value in the last week. Now the entire influencer industry is maybe $5 billion. So 20 times the size of this entire industry they lost in a week. It's a pretty staggering number. And so I think a lot of people are throwing their hands up saying, I can't believe Facebook did this. And it's right, but unfortunately, for anyone working in the space, they just don't care. And this is a similar conversation we talk about with the algorithm, right? With influencers being I'm so frustrated. Why is Instagram doing this? It's unfortunately, the platform is so big now that it doesn't matter what anyone says, because they're playing on a scale that is nearly unfathomable, just how big they are and how sweeping the implications are. So I'm sure you all have started to notice some of the tools and some of the things that you used to use and rely on didn't work anymore. Again, we feel like we got out of this pretty unscathed, and y'all shouldn't really notice any big differences in the platform. And if anything, we have a lot of exciting stuff coming out. Even as you guys watch this video this week, the week that you're watching this, we're already going to be releasing new things. And so we're super excited, but I feel for our compadres in the space. It's tough. It's tough when someone pulls out the rug from you like that. And, I think that we all, again, y'all feel like this with the algorithm, that it is tough when your business is dependent on something else that you have no control over. And we just have to try and operate in the world that those places create for us. So, interesting week, but we move forward into questions. Question 1. So question 1, Coachella. How do I get invites? How do I maximize my exposure during the events? Well, my caveat to this is that I've never been to Coachella, that actually the whole idea of music festivals is a fucking nightmare to me. Being stuck in a field with a bunch of people wearing bandanas as shirts and flower crowns is my idea of hell. And so I don't really, I have no experience at a show, at a festival myself. Now, how do you get invited? I think it's getting harder and harder for influencers to go as a guest of a brand. I think that 5 years ago, it was a lot cheaper to do something at Coachella. Now there are so many brands working in that space that, you know, renting a house, getting hotel rooms is massively expensive. And so I think you have to have a pretty decent sized following to expect that you're going to get flown out by a brand to go to Coachella. We also see brands pulling back from Coachella, again, because the amount of money you would need to spend is so much higher than it used to be to create an impact, because so many brands are doing things there. Similar thing happening in Art Basel. There's a general like pulling back from it, because if 30 brands are activating during a weekend in Miami, it's going to be pretty hard for your brand to stand out and be memorable. So there's that. I think it's just naturally is more difficult. Like anything, my advice wouldn't be much different than the Fashion Week advice we had. If you want a brand to send you to Coachella, you probably will have to start by going to Coachella and paying for it yourself, covering brands that you think are, that you know send influencers. Okay, so if H&M sends 10 influencers every year, be like, cool, next year H&M is going to send me. How do I get there? How do I do that? Okay, well first I go to Coachella myself, I wear H&M, I do some posts organically for them throughout the year, try and build that relationship, keep posting, keep emailing, try and get coffees, try and get dinners, do whatever you can do to set that situation up. That would probably be the best. Again, that's no different than our advice with Fashion Week. You sometimes have to show that you can do the work before people will give it to you, unless you just have such a massive following and that it just happens for you. But for us mere mortals, that would be my advice. And as far as maximizing exposure during the event, I think about what you think your audience wants to see. I struggle during Coachella because it's a lot of like music doesn't sound good during music festivals, like during live shows on Insta stories. So it's very skippable content. If I see someone at a concert Insta storying it, it's just like I skip that whole I go on to the next person in my stories feed. So you potentially have lost me for my next 10 stories. That's something to think about. And I know that Instagram shows you how many exits you have on an Insta story if you have a business account. But that's something to look at. You don't want people to leave that story. And so while you may be watching a band that you really like, and in the moment it's incredible because it sounds so good, and you're dancing, you've been drinking, and everything's great, your flower crown looks great, it's probably not going to translate to social, and people are probably going to skip it. So think about actually creating a story that is interesting and engaging, and don't just post a lot because you did drugs for the first time and now you're just everything's amazing and you're licking the grass or something. Nobody needs to see that. So that's my advice.
How many times have you seen people licking the grass on Coachella Instagram stories?
Honestly, not enough. I take that back. If you post an Insta story of you licking the grass, DM that shit to me, I will probably watch that. I think brands are always looking for new places to activate that aren't as crowded. I bet, what's that big shitstorm in the desert? Burning Man is going to have a much bigger year this year than last year. You think now, do I think that a lot of brands will probably do activations out there this year? Yeah, I do. So I think that's on the up and up. I think smaller ones, always the more luxury ones do well. Aspen Food and Wine Festival, but there's always kind of new stuff popping up. That's kind of I think worth paying attention to. And yeah, again, brands are desperate for more content, more festivals, more places to kind of speak to their consumers. So, but Coachella is like the Super Bowl of festivals, and it's very hard for a brand to have an impact there. And thus, they need to work with the biggest influencers to make sure they get their money's worth. Okay, I have a big following, 150,000 followers, but I'm not getting any brand deals. How can I transition from being well-known to well-paid? It's a good question. I think we talked about this a while ago, but I'll say it again. just because you have a big following doesn't mean, it doesn't entitle you to brand work. And I think the person that asked this question wasn't saying they felt entitled, but I think because Instagram is so much bigger than it used to be, and any platform is true of this, YouTube, blogs, whatever. These platforms are all so big now that having 150,000 followers 5 years ago was massive. And you would have just, by nature of having that following, been known. But now, unfortunately, there are a lot of people that have a following that large. And if your following isn't comprised of people that work at PR firms and brands and are making these decisions, you could be operating in this bubble that is just outside of their kind of viewpoint, and you'll never get any brand deals. I'd sometimes talk about it with circles. I say here's, if you think about it, it's this is the people that you follow, right? So if I'm a brand and I want to work with people, the first thing I think of is, who do I follow? Okay, that's this. And then there's the circle around it of just easy to get to, right? It's people you've heard of, it's people you've seen tagged, it's people someone mentioned to you, it's someone who you really like follows. That's also really easy to find. That's where most brands stop. Where FOR helps brands is this circle, and then this circle, and then this circle, and then this circle. How do you get way outside of your kind of sphere of understanding or your view? So if you're not in that inner circle, then you're going to have a hard time getting brand deals. Now, there are ways to get around that. I think that you have to be more aggressive in your outbound. I think you have to be reaching out to brands. I think you have to be, following people that work at these brands and engaging with them, going to New York, going to LA, San Francisco, meeting with them, trying to get coffees. I think you need to not sit around and wait for someone to reach out, but really put the effort in to get out there and try and get in front of them. Nothing ventured, nothing gained. I just think it's getting harder and harder for any influencer to be getting a lot of work without doing a lot of outbound and doing the work themselves. Unless you're one of those people that right now is super hot and everyone wants to work with, but that's pretty rare in the space. I think more likely is that the people who are getting paid are hustling pretty hard for it. And I would say that the people who are kind of really hot right now and a lot of people want to work with them, it's probably because they spent the last 2 years hustling really hard for brand contacts. And once someone sees, again, we think about that. Think about the way people usually find people, right? Who they follow, and then their ring outside of that. Now, if you were following one of the influencers that went on the Chloe trip to the desert, and you went on that trip because you hustled hard to meet the Chloe team and you got on that trip, and they saw you tagged in a bunch of photos, and then they go and they click on the feed and they look at it, that's how that stuff works. You've now gone from out here, if we're in this circle, if we're thinking the circles, who they follow, the ring, this is where they're making decisions, and you're out here, and now all of a sudden you go on a trip with an influencer that's here, you're now in that circle. You're now in contention. You have to get out there, and I think a lot of it is you have to hustle a good amount. Question 3 is, what number of followers makes you a micro-influencer? Are brands looking at micro-influencers more? Is engagement versus a large following being talked about? So, what makes you a micro-influencer? This is different across all verticals, across countries, across platforms, okay? So, I was in London a year ago. I was talking to a big agency out there that do a lot of influencer work. They were talking about micro-influencers, as they would say. Morons. And I was like, wait, what do you consider a micro-influencer? And they're like, a micro-influencer is 1,500 followers. And I was like, 1,500 followers? My fucking mom's dog has that many followers. That's not a micro-influencer. My mom's dog doesn't have an Instagram account, but it is adorable. I was shocked that in England they consider 1,500 to 3,000 followers a micro-influencer, because that is, for us, it kind of starts at 10K, where you start to say, okay, this is this is potentially someone that we'd look to work with. So we say 10 to 100K is a micro influencer. Now, again, we've said it's different in different spaces. If you're a menswear influencer, that's 10,000 bigger than it is if you're a female beauty influencer. If you are, from Paris, the followings aren't as big as in Paris. So like your following could be smaller, but in that space you're bigger. Now you could be a female beauty influencer and have 30,000 followers, and in the grand scheme of things, that's not huge. But let's say you very publicly live in Chicago and you talk about Chicago a lot. Well, now all of a sudden that's a little bigger because you're now a beauty influencer living in Chicago. So maybe you're one of the biggest beauty influencers living in Chicago. So it's, we could put these kind of labels across the board, but I think what is important is that you have the ability to sell yourself in any way that you can. And you need to figure out your account, look at it, and ask yourself, what's the story that I can tell from this account? Because being like, yeah, I'm a beauty influencer and I have 30,000 followers and I have good engagement. Okay, that's one way to say it. Another way to say it is, yeah, I have 30,000 people. Most of them are in Chicago. People from Chicago are very proud of the city, and honestly, our lives are different than those of the women that live in LA or in New York, and the vibe is different, and the style is different, and the way we wear makeup is a little bit different. And so, for Chicagoans, I don't know what it is. Is that what it is? Who the fuck knows? It's just Chicago. Who cares? For people who live in Chicago, it's really important for them to hear from a voice that is in Chicago. And so while I only have 30,000 followers, those 30,000 followers trust me a lot more than they would someone with 1 million followers in LA. And so it's a simple it's simply figuring out the story that you can tell. Everyone has a story. This is what sales is, and you need to figure out how to tell that story effectively. Are brands looking to work with micro-influencers more? Absolutely. Is there a compelling story to tell from an engagement perspective for micro-influencers? 100%, there definitely is. Are you up against the fact that brands' goals are now so big that your 50,000 or 100,000 followers is just not going to cut it? Yeah. And so one of the benefits of working with a company like us is that we can run campaigns with thousands of micro-influencers. And so we can get brands the reach and the scale that they need to make an impact on the bottom line. But if you're just a normal brand and you say, okay, I've got bandwidth to do 5 influencer activations or work with 5 influencers this month, and I could work with 5 people with 500,000 followers or, 5 people with 10,000, it's going to be a similar amount of work. So they're going to optimize for as much reach as they can get. So again, important for you to be able to tell the story of why you are valuable and why they should be working with you. And I think naturally, if you're a micro-influencer, you need to be trying to stand out more, going above and beyond for that brand, over-delivering, sending them the report after, emailing them with all the content, just making their life as easy as possible. Because you live in the reality is that in the grand scheme of things, you're not the big fish you want to be yet. So you gotta hustle harder. This is something we have to do every day at 4. We're not a huge company with 21 people or something here. And that means that when we're working with these big, massive brands, we need to try even harder than other people do. Because we need that brand to step back and be like, oh, that was really impressive. That felt like a 500-person company. That's how professional it felt. That's how seamless it felt. So think about that in your own life. Work your ass off. Learn how to tell your story. That's all for me.